My name is Margaret Hanley. I am 68 years old, a retired nurse, and for most of my life, I believed my greatest achievement was raising my only daughter, Melissa, on my own after her father passed away. I have spent decades on my feet, caring for patients through the long nights, then coming home to a little girl who depended on me for everything. I built a life for us, steady and modest, but filled with the kind of love that I thought could never be shaken. Until the day Melissa called me, and, in one breath, swept all of it aside. I remember it so clearly. The late afternoon light was falling across my kitchen, touching the chipped porcelain teacup that once belonged to my mother. I was about to pour myself a cup when the phone rang. Her name lit up the screen, and I smiled without thinking. It had been weeks since we last spoke. When I answered, her voice was clipped, almost rehearsed. "We're already married, Mom. Only those who truly matter were invited. Just mail the beach house keys and stop overreacting." I froze. My fingers tightened around the handle of the cup until I was afraid it might break in my hand. The words sank in slowly, heavier than anything I had ever lifted in my years as a nurse. Already married. Only those who truly matter. Mail the keys. Stop overreacting. Each phrase landed like a small stone, building a wall between us so quickly I could barely catch my breath. I could hear faint laughter in the background. Not hers, but a man's. Tyler's. Her new husband, though she had not told me his name would carry that title before this moment. I said nothing. The silence on my end stretched long enough for her to sigh impatiently. "Mom, please, just send the keys by Friday. We're planning to use the beach house for our honeymoon. To save on costs. It makes sense." The beach house, Cape Elizabeth. The one place that held the summers of her childhood, the scent of salt water and sunscreen, the sound of her laughter chasing gulls along the shoreline. A place I had fought to keep in our family even when bills stacked up higher than I could pay. That house was our anchor. I set the cup down on the counter, staring at its tiny crack along the rim. I thought about the mornings when Melissa would sit at the kitchen table, swinging her legs as she ate toast before school. I thought about the promise she once made at 12 years old, barefoot in the sand, saying she would marry right there, with lights strung between the dunes and the ocean behind her. Now, she wanted the keys without me, without even telling me she was married. I finally spoke, my voice quiet, steady, as if reading a chart in a hospital ward. "I see. Congratulations. That's all? You're not upset?" she asked, suspicion in her tone. I smiled, though she could not see it. "No, sweetheart. If that's what makes you happy." She sounded relieved, even a little smug. "Good. Then just send the keys and I'll take care of it." I cut in, still calm. We exchanged a few more perfunctory words before I hung up. I stood there for a long time, the quiet in the kitchen pressing in from all sides. My hands wrapped around the teacup again, its familiar weight grounding me. Then something shifted inside me. A nurse knows when a wound needs stitches instead of a bandage. And I knew, without a shadow of doubt, that this wound between us had been carefully created, cultivated by someone who wanted me gone from her life, or at least from her property. 3 days later, I stood outside her apartment building. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of rain. In my hands was a neatly wrapped silver box, tied with a crisp, white ribbon. Inside was my wedding gift, a leather portfolio, packed with documents that told a truth Tyler had hoped would never reach Melissa's eyes. I set the box carefully at their door, rang the bell once, and walked away without looking back. I had barely reached my car when a voice split the air behind me. A man's voice, high-pitched, furious. "What the hell is this?" It rose into a yell that didn't stop. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove off with the sound of his rage chasing me down the street. My hands were steady on the wheel. For the first time in months, I felt the old strength returning. Not loud or showy, but certain. Some wounds need more than silence. They need the truth. And I had just delivered it to their doorstep. The sound of his shouting still rang faintly in my ears as I drove home that day, but the steady hum of the road began to carry me somewhere else. Somewhere far from the damp smell of their apartment hallway. In my mind, I was back in Cape Elizabeth on a summer afternoon when Melissa was 12. The sky had been impossibly blue that year, the kind of blue that made the ocean look like it was stitched right into it. I can still see her, barefoot, hair windblown and tangled from hours of running along the shoreline. She had a faded yellow pail in her hand, filled halfway with shells she insisted were too perfect to leave behind. Her laugh was carried by the breeze, sharp and clear, like the call of the gulls overhead. I remember standing at the edge of the deck, a mug of cocoa warming my hands, watching her chase the retreating waves until her feet were swallowed by the foamy rush. That beach house was more than a building to us. It was the backdrop of her childhood, the stage for every summer ritual we created together. There was one evening in particular that always returns to me. The day had been hot, the kind of heat that makes the sand stick stubbornly to your skin. After dinner, Melissa had pulled an old blanket onto the deck so we could watch the sunset. The ocean had turned a deep copper, reflecting the last light of day. She sat cross-legged beside me, sipping cocoa from a porcelain teacup that once belonged to my mother. It was too big for her hands then, so she cradled it carefully, sipping slowly. That teacup has a small chip on the rim near the handle. My mother gave it to me when I moved into my first apartment, telling me that some things are meant to last if you treat them gently enough. I carried it with me through years of cramped kitchens and late-night nursing shifts, through joy and disappointment, and into the beach house where Melissa grew up. Somehow, it survived every move, every careless bump, except for that one tiny chip, a reminder that even the strongest things can be marked by time. Melissa used to call it the lucky cup. She would choose it over any mug in the cupboard, even when I told her it wasn't practical. She claimed cocoa tasted better in it, that it made the drink feel special. I never argued. Watching her small hands clutch that delicate piece of our family history filled me with a quiet pride. That night on the deck, she leaned against me and said, "When I get married, I want it to be here, Mom. Barefoot, on the sand, with fairy lights and music. And afterward, we'll sit here and drink cocoa from the lucky cup." I had smiled, brushing the damp hair from her forehead. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart." Back then, I believed promises like that could hold their shape forever. I didn't know how easily someone could come along and bend them, twist them into something unrecognizable. Now, all these years later, the cup sits on the same kitchen counter where I stood when Melissa called to tell me she was already married, that only those who truly matter had been invited, and that she wanted the beach house keys mailed to her. When I looked at it after hanging up, I realized it had outlasted everything else. Friends have come and gone, seasons have shifted, even my career has ended. But the cup remains, scarred, imperfect, and still standing. The beach house has always felt like that cup to me. It carries the marks of time, the weathered railings, the faint smell of salt in the wood, the squeak in the third step leading to the deck. Yet it has held together through storms, through years when I wasn't sure I could keep it. It has been a place of refuge for both of us, the one constant we could always return to, which is why the thought of it in Tyler's hands, stripped of its history, reduced to property value, stirs something in me I can't ignore. He doesn't understand that the worth of that house can't be counted in dollars. Its walls know our laughter. Its floors have felt our bare feet. Its windows have framed the view of every dream Melissa ever dared to speak aloud. I took the cup into my hands again that evening, running my finger over the chip. Some things are worth protecting, even if you have to do it quietly. Even if it means letting go of what you thought would last, to save the part that still can. That night, as the ocean wind rattled the windows, I knew the beach house and the lucky cup would not be surrendered so easily. The memory of that first meeting with Tyler slips into my mind whenever I think about how everything began to change. It was late autumn, the kind of chilly afternoon where the air smells faintly of wood smoke. I had just pulled a casserole from the oven when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Melissa had called earlier, her voice bright with excitement. She was bringing someone special for dinner. When they stepped inside, I was met with the sight of a tall man in a charcoal suit that looked more suited for a corporate boardroom than my cozy Maine home. Tyler's hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his smile was broad and easy, but there was something about it that felt practiced, as if he had stood in front of a mirror until it looked just right. "Mrs. Hanley," he said warmly, extending a hand before Melissa even had the chance to introduce us. "It's an honor. Melissa has told me so much about you." His grip was firm, deliberate, the kind you expect from a salesman sealing a deal. I noticed the cologne. Expensive, sharp, almost too assertive for such a small space. Melissa beamed between us, oblivious to my subtle pause before I returned the handshake. We moved into the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth. Tyler's gaze drifted around the room in a way that was polite on the surface, but I felt it like a scan, taking inventory. His eyes landed on the bookshelf, the antique clock, the framed photographs. Then he saw it, the large canvas print of the beach house at Cape Elizabeth, taken at sunset. He stepped toward it, hands clasped behind his back. "This is beautiful," he said, the tone casual, but his eyes lingered just a beat too long. "Do you get out there often?" "Every summer," I replied, my voice even. "It's been in the family for years." Melissa chimed in quickly, her voice full of fondness. "We spent every summer there, Mom and I. Best memories of my life." Tyler smiled at her words, but when he looked back at the photograph, I caught something flicker in his expression. Not nostalgia, not admiration. Something closer to calculation. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that polished charm. We sat down to dinner, the table set with my old china. Tyler complimented the food before he even took a bite, then launched into a string of thoughtful questions about my career as a nurse, my years raising Melissa on my own, and the history of the town. He laughed in the right places, nodded with just the right amount of interest. If I had been meeting him as a stranger in a social setting, I might have thought he was perfect. But I know people. Years in hospital corridors teach you to read faces, to catch the subtle signs that someone's words don't quite match their eyes. Tyler's eyes were quick, too quick. They darted to Melissa when she spoke, as if measuring her value. Then, back to me, assessing something I couldn't yet name. At one point, while Melissa was in the kitchen getting dessert, Tyler leaned back in his chair and let his gaze wander again. It stopped at the sideboard where I kept a small frame with a photograph of my mother and me on the deck of the beach house. He picked it up without asking, turning it slightly toward the light. "This must be a special place," he said softly, almost as if to himself. "It is," I replied, my voice steady but cool. "It's where we've celebrated every important milestone in our family." His eyes flicked to mine then, and for a brief moment, I felt as though we were speaking about something entirely different. Melissa returned with 2 plates of apple pie and a proud smile, and whatever passed between us dissolved under the weight of her happiness. She looked at Tyler the way she used to look at the ocean from the beach house porch, like it could never hurt her. I swallowed the instinct to ask him why he was so interested in a house he'd never been to. I told myself not to ruin her night, not to plant suspicion in a heart so clearly caught up in hope. Instead, I asked about his work, listened as he spoke about investments and client portfolios with an easy confidence. When they left that evening, Tyler shook my hand again, thanking me for the meal. "You must be so proud of Melissa," he said warmly. "I am," I answered, and I meant it. But as I closed the door behind them, I lingered by the window, watching them walk to the car. Tyler opened the passenger door for her, but even as he smiled at her, his eyes flicked toward the house one last time, toward the framed photograph on the wall just inside. That was the first time I felt the faint ripple of something beneath the surface. I didn't know then how deep it would go, or how far Tyler was willing to reach into our lives. But I knew enough to keep my eyes open, and my mouth, for now, closed. The weeks after that dinner moved quietly, as if someone had nudged the furniture of our lives half an inch to the left. I noticed a tilt rather than a crash. Melissa still called at lunch, but the conversations tightened, her eyes on the clock. The first unmistakable sign came on a Wednesday. "Tyler thinks we should put our relationship first. He says couples do better when they build their own routines," she said, aiming for casual, while her breath snagged. I told her I understood. I did not want to be the kind of mother who clung so tightly that love could not breathe. That weekend she texted instead of calling. "Busy with Tyler's work dinner. Talk soon." Talk soon became talk later. Talk later became a quiet that stretched like faint music. A month passed. She called with the cadence of a memorized note. "Mom, we talked about family boundaries. It is healthier if I handle stress with my partner. We should try fewer calls for a while." She paused, listening to another room. I heard Tyler's voice shaping the air around her. I took a breath that tasted like early spring sea. "If that is what you need, sweetheart." "It is not permanent," she said quickly. "Just while we recalibrate." Recalibrate. The word sounded clinical, as if our bond were a machine to be tuned. After the call, I traced the chip on the teacup with my thumb and asked the question that keeps a mother honest. Am I holding on too hard, or is someone prying my hand away? The pattern strengthened. Sunday chats became midweek check-ins. Then they slipped to once every other week. When she did call, I heard another rhythm beneath her voice, like footsteps in a hallway. She told me about Tyler's promotion dinners, Tyler's obligations, Tyler's networking trips. Each story put him in the center of the frame. One evening, I drove to the city with a pot of chicken soup because she had texted that she was sick. I stood at the curb and rang her buzzer. She came down with a scarf and a careful smile. "You should have called first," she said. "Tyler is resting and he needs quiet." "I will be quick. I brought soup." "That is kind, but he wants me to manage my own care. We are working on independence. Next time, just leave it at the door." I handed her the container. Our fingers touched. She startled as if the heat bit her. I wanted to say that independence and isolation are cousins who dress alike. I swallowed the line. She kissed my cheek, whispered thanks, and disappeared. On the drive home, I argued with myself. Maybe I leaned on her too often after her father died. Maybe our closeness became a shelter that kept her from building her own walls. Or maybe someone was drawing those walls around her, brick by careful brick, and calling the enclosure love. The doubt felt moral, as if a good mother would step back no matter how it hurt. Tyler's advice soon arrived directly. He called one afternoon from Melissa's phone, reasonable and smooth. "Mrs. Hanley, you raised an extraordinary woman. I want to protect what you built. The best way is to help her become fully independent. Less daily contact will give us room to grow." His tone was satin over stone. I thanked him for caring. I did not agree or disagree. After we hung up, I listened to the house breathe. The floorboards answered in tiny clicks. The clock kept time without drama. My silence was not surrender. It was a watchman's stance. The calls tapered further. A month slipped by. When the phone finally rang, I almost missed it. Melissa sounded formal. "We will be with Tyler's family for the holiday. It is important for us to establish traditions." I looked at the photograph of the beach house at sunset. The water held the color of copper. The horizon was a calm line. I said I hoped they would have a wonderful time. Then I set the teacup beside the kettle and watched steam rise. In the stillness, I asked the hardest question. If my presence threatens her happiness, should I erase myself for her sake? Or does love sometimes require staying in place so the lighthouse still shines when a ship loses its bearings? I did not know the answer. I only knew the light must be kept burning. Until then, I would keep watch, steady as the tide through nightfall. It happened on a gray Saturday morning in early March. I was in the kitchen, the kettle humming on the stove, when my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen, expecting a weather alert or a message from Janice, my oldest friend. Instead, it was a Facebook post from one of Melissa's college friends. The image filled the screen, Melissa's hand extended toward the camera, a diamond catching the light like a shard of ice. In the blurred background, Tyler's arm circled her waist. The caption read, "He asked." I said yes. Can't wait to start forever. There were already dozens of likes, a cascade of congratulations. For a moment, I simply stared at the picture. The edges of the phone felt cold in my hand. I checked the date, posted an hour ago. No call, no text, no whisper of this from my daughter. I scrolled through the comments, looking for some mention of me, some sign that perhaps this was a joke or a staged photo. There was nothing. I dialed her number before my tea had time to steep. She answered on the third ring, her voice breathless and light. "Mom, I was going to call you this morning?" "Melissa," I said, trying to keep my tone steady, "I just saw your post." "Oh, that," she laughed. "It happened last night. Tyler surprised me at our favorite restaurant. His parents were so thrilled. They started planning an engagement dinner right away. An engagement dinner? I repeated. When is it? Next Saturday, she said quickly. It's just a small gathering, immediate family, and a few close friends. I suppose I should plan to come down Friday night then, I said, already picturing the drive. There was a pause. Then her voice softened, as though she were explaining something delicate to a child. Mom, it's really for Tyler's side. His mother has very specific traditions. She wanted to keep it within their circle. I gripped the edge of the counter. So, I'm not invited. It's not like that, she insisted. We'll do something special, just the three of us, soon. Soon. A word with no calendar date, no commitment. I told her I understood, wished her happiness, and ended the call before my voice betrayed me. Later that afternoon, Janice came over. She had a habit of dropping by unannounced, usually with a tin of cookies or a jar of jam. Today, she brought both. She found me at the kitchen table, the laptop open to that same photo of Melissa's hand. I take it you've seen it, she said, sliding into the chair opposite mine. I nodded. She called after I did, said the dinner is for his family only. Traditions, apparently. Janice's eyes narrowed, the way they did when she spotted a billing error. Maggie, that's not normal. You're her mother. Traditions or not, you belong at that table. She says we'll have our own celebration, I murmured, though the words felt thin. Janice reached across and touched my hand. You've been there for every big moment of her life. This is the first one you're being told to sit out. That's not a coincidence. I wanted to argue, to defend Melissa's choice, to pretend this was nothing more than a misunderstanding. But Janice had known me since I was 21. She had seen me through the loss of my husband, through nights of double shifts, through every scraped knee and school recital Melissa ever had. She could read the truth in my eyes before I said a word. Tyler's mother doesn't know me, I said finally. Maybe she thinks she's doing what's best. Or maybe Tyler knows exactly what he's doing, Janice countered. You said he was interested in the beach house. I closed the laptop and stared at the chipped teacup beside me. It's too soon to think the worst. Janice didn't push, but her silence was full of caution. She had raised 2 sons, and she knew the signs of influence when she saw them. Just keep your eyes open, Maggie. Love makes people blind, not just the ones in it, but the ones watching from the outside. That night, I sat by the fire with the photo still glowing on my phone screen. The diamond sparkled as though it could erase every shadow. Melissa's smile was genuine, her eyes shining. I wanted to freeze her in that happiness, to believe Tyler's arm was a promise, and not a claim. But Janice's words lingered. This was the first celebration I had been asked to skip. And if there is a first, there is often a second. I sipped my tea from the lucky cup, its chip pressing against my lip, and wondered how many more moments would be labeled, "Not for you." The first Christmas without her began with a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes. It was early December, the air outside brittle with frost. Melissa's voice was cheerful, almost hurried. Mom, about Christmas. Tyler's family has this tradition. Everyone gathers at his parents' cabin in Vermont. They do the whole week together, from Christmas Eve to New Year's. It's really important to them. I leaned against the kitchen counter, holding the phone closer to my ear. So you won't be coming here. I wish I could be in 2 places at once, she said quickly. But Tyler feels it's important we start our married life with his traditions. You understand, right? I swallowed the sting. Of course. Traditions matter. She thanked me, promised to call on Christmas morning, and hung up. I stood in the quiet kitchen for a long time, the sound of the wind outside scratching faintly against the windows. That year, the house felt larger than usual. I still put up the tree in the living room, its lights casting soft glows against the walls. I decorated the mantel with the same ornaments Melissa had unwrapped since she was a child. Tiny glass snowmen, a set of carved wooden reindeer, and the angel she'd insisted always belong at the top. They looked the same, but without her laughter and music in the background, the sparkle felt dimmer. On Christmas Eve, I built a fire in the hearth. The flames crackled, filling the room with that deep, resinous scent of burning pine. I sat in my old armchair, the lucky teacup warm between my palms. The tea steamed upward, a ribbon of heat against my face. My thumb traced the chip on the rim, the familiar notch my mother had once called a mark of survival. The silence was different from the quiet I'd known in years past, when Melissa had gone to bed, and I'd stayed up to watch the embers fade. This was a heavier kind of silence, the kind that settled over you and made you aware of every creak in the floorboards, every faint sigh of the wind in the chimney. I let my eyes close for a moment and pictured the Christmases we'd shared here. Melissa in flannel pajamas, hair a tangle of sleep, tearing into her stocking. The way she'd curl up beside me under a blanket, cocoa in hand, watching the snow fall through the window. The two of us singing along to carols with voices we never cared to tune. These were the traditions that had kept us warm, not because they were elaborate, but because they were ours. Now she was in a cabin hundreds of miles away, surrounded by people who didn't know the smell of our kitchen on Christmas morning, or the way the light fell through the dining room window onto a table set for two. The fire shifted, sending up a spark that landed on the hearthstone and fizzled out. I watched it vanish, the dark spot it left behind, still faintly glowing. And it struck me then, the thought so clear it felt like someone had whispered it aloud. Some traditions keep you warm. Some, they just burn out. I set the cup on the side table and reached for the small box of photographs I kept near the hearth. Inside were pictures from our first Christmas in the beach house, after I'd managed to buy it back from a distant relative who had been ready to sell. Melissa was 7 in those pictures, her cheeks flushed from playing outside, her arms wrapped around me in a hug that nearly knocked me over. I remembered the relief of knowing I had saved a place where we could belong. This year, that belonging felt more fragile. Tyler's family traditions had taken priority, and I couldn't tell if Melissa was adapting or disappearing. The thought sat heavy on my chest, but I reminded myself of the chipped cup, how it had survived moves, accidents, years of use. Maybe our traditions could survive too, even if they changed shape. The fire burned lower. I added another log, watching the flames take hold, licking at the wood until it glowed. Warmth seeped back into the room, and I leaned into the armchair, letting it wrap around me. On the mantel, the angel figurine caught the light, its porcelain face serene. I wondered if next Christmas she might return, if she might remember what our holidays felt like before new traditions crowded them out. Or maybe I would have to accept that some flames aren't meant to be stoked forever. I picked up the cup again, held it steady, and sipped. The tea was cooling, but it still tasted like home. It was late January when the phone rang, the kind of winter afternoon where the snow outside made the light in the house seem even dimmer. I recognized Janice's number immediately. She rarely called during the day unless something mattered. "Maggie," she began, her tone already heavy, "I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." I set down the laundry basket and pressed the phone closer. "Go on." "You remember my coworker, Diane? The one who retired last year? She called me this morning after seeing that picture of Melissa and Tyler on Facebook. Turns out, Tyler used to date one of her colleagues. Different woman, same pattern. Moved fast, got close to her family, then started making little suggestions about money and property. When she caught on, he was gone in a week. I felt a knot form in my stomach. And Diane's sure it's the same man? Positive. She even remembered his middle name. Janice paused, her voice softening. "Maggie, this isn't just bad luck. This is what he does." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the chipped teacup warm between my palms. I thought about Melissa's sudden distance, the way Tyler's gaze had lingered on the beach house photo that first night. I decided to start quietly. I called one of Melissa's college friends, a woman named Claire I'd met a few times at the beach house over the summers. We chatted about work, about the weather, and then I asked if she knew much about Tyler before Melissa met him. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the hum of her refrigerator through the line. "I don't know all the details," Claire admitted, "but I do know he was engaged before. Twice, actually. Both ended suddenly. One of them, well, her family found out something they didn't like about his finances." I thanked her, careful not to push further, and ended the call. My next step was the public library. Old habits from my nursing days, when you needed to find out the truth about a patient's history, came back easily. I scrolled through archived local newspapers, my fingers tapping restlessly against the keyboard. It took 3 visits, but I found it. An article from almost 20 years ago about a failed development project on the coast. The names jumped out at me. Robert Hanley, my husband, and a partner named William Keating. The project had collapsed under the weight of missing funds. Over $2 million gone. Robert had never spoken in detail about it, only that the loss had nearly bankrupted him and cost him friendships he'd once valued. But there was another detail in the article. William Keating was Tyler's maternal grandfather. I stared at the screen, the hum of the library's heating system suddenly loud in my ears. I scrolled further, pulling up follow-up stories. Keating had been accused of diverting project funds into private accounts, then moving them offshore before disappearing to Florida. No conviction. He died in a car accident before the investigation concluded. The money had never been recovered. That night, I went through Robert's old files in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. It smelled faintly of his aftershave, though it had been nearly 15 years since he passed. In a folder marked Legal, I found correspondence from his attorney about the development collapse. Robert's notes in the margins were brief but telling. Keating, untrustworthy. Missing funds tied to personal accounts. No closure. I sat back on the bed, the papers spread across my lap. The unspoken truth began to form. Tyler wasn't just some charming opportunist who had stumbled into Melissa's life. His family name was tied to the single worst financial betrayal my husband had ever endured. And now, all these years later, that same family was circling the one thing of value I still held: the beach house. I wondered if Melissa knew, if Tyler had told her about his grandfather's history, or if, like Robert all those years ago, she would only discover the truth when the damage was done. The thought made my chest tighten. I had never told Melissa much about that chapter of Robert's life. She'd been too young, and I'd wanted to shield her from the ugliness of betrayal. But maybe that silence had made her vulnerable to a man who saw her as a way to finish a job his grandfather had started. I folded the papers carefully and set them beside the teacup on my nightstand. The cup's small chip caught the light from the lamp, a reminder that even the strongest things can be marred, but they can also endure. That night, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't accuse without proof, and I wouldn't push Melissa into a choice she wasn't ready to make. But I would keep looking, keep gathering, until the truth was undeniable. Because some patterns aren't coincidence, they're inheritance. And I wasn't about to let my daughter become the next chapter in a story that had already cost this family too much. The next 2 weeks became a quiet exercise in patience, the kind that feels almost like knitting. Each thread of information had to be pulled gently, examined, then set in its place. I moved through my days as if nothing had changed, shopping for groceries, tidying the house, keeping my morning walks along the shoreline. But every spare moment was devoted to finding the next piece of the puzzle. I started with public records, combing through online databases, property transfers, and corporate filings. Tyler's name appeared more than once, often tied to shell companies that dissolved within a year. I found bank liens that had been quietly satisfied, suggesting debts repaid from sources that didn't match his reported income. I printed everything, each page sliding into a folder on the dining room table. In the afternoons, I would make tea in the chipped porcelain cup, my lucky cup, and set it beside the growing stack of papers. It became a kind of ritual. Pour the boiling water, watch the steam curl into the air, and let the truth steep alongside it. The warmth of the cup in my hands reminded me that some things survive time and damage. They just require care. The more I found, the clearer the picture became. There was a pattern to Tyler's movements: relationships with women who had assets, sudden entanglements in their finances, and then a disappearance when questions began to surface. Claire's hint about his 2 broken engagements proved true. I tracked down brief announcements in society pages, both of them ending without explanation. In one case, the woman's family sold a vacation property within months of the split. It felt like assembling a jigsaw puzzle without the box image, just the slow satisfaction of each piece clicking into place. Every time I slid another printed article or legal document into the folder, I imagined a corner of the picture sharpening. The edges were forming now, and I could see enough to understand that this wasn't a coincidence or bad luck. It was a practiced method, honed over years. One evening, as the wind battered against the windows, I spread the documents out across the dining table. The lamp cast a warm circle of light over the pages, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. In the center sat the teacup, half full, its steam curling lazily toward the ceiling. I looked at it and thought how steeping tea is not so different from uncovering a truth. You add heat, give it time, and slowly, what was hidden seeps out into the open. The connection to his grandfather, William Keating, still pressed on me. That unresolved theft from Robert's project wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a wound left unhealed. Now, decades later, Tyler was positioned to reach for what was left: our beach house. I could almost feel Robert's presence in the room, the weight of his silence in those old files, the way he'd never been able to reclaim what was taken. But unlike Roberts, I had the benefit of foresight and the steadiness that comes from years of listening more than speaking. My work as a nurse had taught me that the truth often reveals itself without being forced. You don't always have to confront. Sometimes you just have to prepare, so that when the moment comes, the facts speak for themselves. I decided then, I wouldn't go to Melissa with accusations. If I charged in now, Tyler would spin my words, plant doubts, make her believe I was jealous or overprotective. I'd seen it happen to other families. Once the wedge was in, it was almost impossible to pull it out. No, I would let the truth knock on her door itself, in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. I gathered the pages back into the folder, smoothing each one as I placed it inside. The stack was substantial now, a portrait in black and white of the man my daughter thought she knew. I slid the folder into the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, beside Robert's old papers, and rested the teacup on top for a moment, before carrying it back to the kitchen. Standing at the sink, rinsing the cup, I felt a strange calm. There was power in waiting, in being ready. Tyler didn't know it, but every move he made now would only tighten the frame I was building around him. And when the picture was complete, Melissa wouldn't have to take my word for it. She would see him exactly as he was. For now, I would keep my silence. Let him think I was just an aging mother, content to send holiday cards and polite texts. Let him underestimate me. After all, the longer tea steeps, the stronger it becomes. And I intended to serve this truth at exactly the right temperature. The call came just after dinner, when the kitchen was still warm from the oven and the last traces of garlic and rosemary lingered in the air. I recognized Melissa's number immediately. It had been weeks since we'd last spoken, and something in me hoped, foolishly, that she was calling just to check in, to hear my voice. "Hi, Mom," she began, a little too brightly. "Tyler and I were thinking, since you're not using the beach house much, maybe we could spend our honeymoon there. Just a week. We'd take good care of it." Her words landed like small, deliberate stones. There was no, "How are you?" or "Would you be okay with this?" Just the request, framed as if it were a foregone conclusion. I swallowed slowly, letting a pause fill the space between us. "Of course," I said, my voice even. "I'll make sure you have the key." Melissa exhaled, relief flooding her tone. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot. We'll come by next week to pick it up." We exchanged a few pleasantries before hanging up, but my mind had already shifted gears entirely. This wasn't just about the beach house anymore. It was about timing. Tyler wanted access, and soon. That meant his plan was moving forward. And if he thought I would hand him the opportunity without preparation, he hadn't been paying attention. I sat at the dining table, the same table that had borne witness to countless birthdays, arguments, reconciliations. The folder of documents sat in the cedar chest upstairs, but in my mind, I could see each page, each headline, each notarized copy. For weeks, I'd been assembling this puzzle. Now it was time to package it. The image came to me suddenly. A gift. Not a confrontation, not a furious outburst in the middle of their honeymoon, but something they would open on their own terms. A box wrapped in understated silver paper, tied neatly with white ribbon. Inside, the truth, documented and undeniable. The next morning, I took out the folder and began to sort through its contents. Every piece of evidence was duplicated. One copy for my own records, one for them. Property records, corporate filings, screenshots of old engagement announcements, even the clipped articles about his grandfather's involvement in Robert's failed project. I placed them in chronological order, each sheet in a protective sleeve. I added a cover letter, handwritten in my neatest script. Melissa, I hope you read this with the same care I have taken in preparing it. Everything inside is part of a larger picture. Some pieces will hurt, some may feel like betrayal, but all of it is the truth. You deserve to know who you have invited into your life. Beside the packet, I placed the spare key to the beach house, polished, glinting in the light. Its cold metal felt almost symbolic. An invitation, yes, but one that came with the weight of choice. Finding the right box took some effort. I went to a small stationery shop in town, one of those places that still smells faintly of ink and pressed paper. The owner, a woman about my age with laugh lines as deep as mine, helped me pick out a silver box just big enough to hold the documents without folding them. "For a wedding gift?" she asked, smiling. "In a way," I replied. That afternoon, I wrapped the box carefully, the silver paper smooth under my hands, the ribbon crisp and straight. When it was finished, it looked elegant, almost celebratory. No one would suspect that inside was something capable of ending a marriage before it truly began. I placed it on the corner of my desk, where the light from the window could catch it. For a moment, I simply looked at it, feeling the mixture of sadness and resolve tighten in my chest. This wasn't the way I'd ever imagined giving my daughter a wedding present. But then, I'd never imagined she would choose a man like Tyler. That night, as I sipped tea and watched the moonlight spill across the floor, I thought about how the truth, like the tide, is inevitable. You can try to hold it back, but sooner or later, it comes in, sweeping away whatever was built on shifting sand. When Melissa came to pick up the key, she would leave with more than she bargained for. And when she opened that box, whether on the first day of her honeymoon or the last, she would finally see the picture I had been quietly piecing together all this time. I wasn't sure what she would do with it, but I knew this. Once you've seen the whole puzzle, you can never pretend you don't know what it shows. The morning I delivered the gift was one of those early spring days when the air is still cold enough to sting your cheeks, but the sunlight tricks you into thinking warmth is just around the corner. I woke before dawn, brewed a pot of tea, and sat for a few minutes in the quiet, hands wrapped around the mug. The silver box sat on the kitchen counter, its ribbon perfectly tied, looking almost innocent. I loaded it into the passenger seat, nestling it into a canvas tote so it wouldn't slide around. The drive to Melissa and Tyler's place took just under an hour, winding through stretches of bare trees and sleepy neighborhoods still shaking off winter. My hands gripped the wheel loosely, my mind calm in a way I hadn't felt for months. When I pulled into their driveway, the house looked still, curtains drawn, no movement behind the windows. I turned off the engine and listened for a moment. Even the street was quiet. I walked up the stone path, my shoes crunching softly on the frost-speckled grass, and set the box just to the right of their front door, where the morning sun would eventually hit it. I took a step back, adjusted the ribbon so it faced forward, and let myself really look at it one last time. The key inside was cool, heavy, and unmistakable. The documents were in perfect order. It wasn't just a package. It was the culmination of weeks of quiet labor, each piece chosen and placed with deliberate care. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I just turned and walked back to the car, the cold air pulling tears to my eyes that had nothing to do with sadness. As I drove away, the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, and with it, any lingering temptation to take the box back. The call came later that afternoon. just as the shadows in my living room had begun to stretch long and thin across the floor. The phone vibrated on the table, Tyler's name flashing on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "What the hell is this?" His voice was already at a shout, ragged at the edges. Somewhere in the background, I heard Melissa's voice, high, choked, pleading for him to calm down. "You left a box at our door," he continued, "full of lies and garbage. You think you can just—" I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. I let the sound of his outrage fill the space between us. Years ago, I might have met him word for word, matching volume with volume, letting anger pull me into its undertow. But not now. "Melissa!" I heard her voice again, closer this time, and then the sound of muffled sobs. The noise in the background told me she had the papers in her hands. I could picture her moving through them, page by page, each one another small crack in whatever story Tyler had told her. Tyler's tone shifted to something sharper, more desperate. "You think this is going to break us? You think—" I spoke then, my voice low, steady, almost soft. "If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to fear." Silence. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could almost hear his mind scrambling, reaching for a response that didn't exist. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, his voice quieter now, but not calmer. "Stay out of our lives." The line went dead before I could reply, though I wasn't planning to say more. I set the phone down on the table and returned to my chair by the fireplace, the tea beside me still warm. Outside, the light was fading into the soft blue of evening, and I thought about how quickly the truth can change the temperature of a room, even one you're not standing in. I didn't know if Melissa would call me that night, or in a week, or ever. But I knew she had the information now, all of it, and no amount of shouting or denial could erase it from her hands. The rest would be her choice to make. For the first time in months, I felt no urge to check my phone, no need to rehearse conversations in my head. The box was delivered. The truth was in motion, and the silence that followed, it wasn't empty. It was the sound of letting go. 3 days passed before I saw her. By then, the weather had turned damp, the kind that clings to your skin and makes the air smell faintly of wet earth. I had just finished sweeping the porch when I noticed a figure sitting on my front steps. Melissa. Her hair was tangled in a way I'd never seen on her, loose strands curling from the damp. Her eyes were swollen, ringed in red. She sat hunched forward, elbows on her knees, like she wasn't sure she had the energy to hold herself up. In her hands was the silver box, the ribbon gone, the lid askew. I opened the screen door slowly. "Melissa?" She looked up at me, and for a moment she didn't speak, just stared, like she was making sure I was real. Then she said, her voice low but cutting through the gray air, "Tell me everything." There was no hostility in her tone, but no gentleness either. Just the weight of someone who had reached the end of wondering and was ready to know. I stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, I led her to the kitchen table, the same place I'd spent weeks sorting through papers, piecing together the story. I made tea without asking. 2 mugs, mine plain, hers with a spoonful of honey just like when she was younger. She didn't touch it. She placed the box on the table between us. "I read it all," she said, her voice catching. "But I need you to tell me how you found it. Why you—" She broke off, shaking her head. "Just start from the beginning." So I did. I reached into the box and pulled out the first folder. The manila edges were soft from handling, the ink on the labels dark and precise. I laid it flat in front of her and opened it to the first page. It started with a conversation. Janice told me she'd heard about Tyler from someone at work, how he'd been in a relationship before you that ended abruptly, right after certain financial problems. Melissa's fingers traced the corner of the page, but she didn't interrupt. I moved to the next folder, the one with the clipped-together news clippings. Then I started looking. Old newspapers, public court records, a few calls to people who knew your father's business partners. Her brow furrowed. You think he... I don't think, I said quietly. I followed what I could verify. I slid the article across to her. The headline was blunt. The words, missing funds and internal investigation, unavoidable. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly, her lips tightening as they formed silent words. I could see her connecting pieces, rearranging events she thought she understood. One by one, I laid the documents out. Contracts with discrepancies, a copy of a deposition from a former associate, bank statements with dates that matched the withdrawals from her father's company account years ago. Melissa leaned back in her chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table. This can't. She trailed off, her gaze darting between the papers and me. It's a lot, I said. And it's not something you wanted to find in your engagement week. But I didn't bring this to hurt you. I brought it because you deserve to know who you're marrying. She looked down at the table again. This time slower, more deliberate. Her fingers tapped against a receipt, then slid to the next page, her eyes narrowing in thought. Some of these dates, they line up with when Tyler said he was traveling for work. I nodded. That's what I noticed, too. For a while, the only sound was the soft rustle of paper as she turned another page. I didn't rush her. This wasn't the kind of truth you could swallow all at once. Finally, she pressed her palms flat against the table, as though grounding herself. So every time I thought he was being distant, every time he brushed off my questions, it was because there was something he didn't want you to see. I finished for her. Melissa's eyes met mine then, and I saw a mixture of grief, disbelief, and a hard, growing clarity. I thought I knew him. I reached for my tea, now lukewarm, and held her gaze. Now you do. She sat back, closing the lid of the box gently but firmly, as though sealing away something poisonous. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just took a long breath, the kind you take before stepping into cold water, and said, I need to think. And I knew that whatever came next was no longer in my hands. Melissa came back 2 evenings later. This time, there was a steadiness in her steps, as if she had spent the past 48 hours deciding what she could handle and what she couldn't. She still looked pale, but her hair was brushed, her coat buttoned to the top, and her eyes had that focused sheen of someone who had made up her mind to confront something head-on. I let her in without a word. We moved to the living room, where the light from the lamp painted the walls in amber. The box of documents sat on the coffee table exactly where she'd left it. She glanced at it, but didn't sit down right away. Instead, she paced a few steps, then turned to me. You kept all this, she said, her voice tight. All these years you've held on to records, clippings, receipts. Was this just in case? Or did you think you'd always find a reason to use them? Her tone wasn't quite accusatory, but it had the edge of someone testing the waters of blame. I stayed seated, my hands folded on my lap. Melissa, I didn't collect these for sport. I started looking when things didn't add up. You know me. I'm not the type to jump to conclusions. She sat finally, dropping onto the edge of the couch, elbows on her knees. It's just seeing it all laid out. I keep thinking about the conversations I've had with him, things he told me, the way he looked at me. Her voice cracked slightly, and she took a breath to steady herself. It's like I'm replaying a movie I thought I understood, and suddenly all the scenes mean something else. I nodded slowly, then reached for my tea, feeling the warm ceramic against my palms. There's something I want to ask you, Melissa, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. She looked at me warily. What? I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but clear. If one day you found out the person you loved came to you only for your money, would you forgive them? The room went still. Melissa's eyes widened a fraction. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, like the words were there but refused to be spoken. She glanced toward the corner of the room, where my old camcorder sat on the bookshelf, its little red standby light blinking faintly. I'd left it there earlier, almost without thinking. "You're recording this?" she asked, her voice low. "No faces," I said evenly. "Just voices, just words. Sometimes it's easier to hear the truth when you can play it back without the heat of the moment." Her shoulders tensed, and she looked away again. "I don't know if I can answer that." "That's the thing about questions like this," I said softly. "They don't need an answer right away, but they have a way of following you until you do." Melissa leaned back, crossing her arms. "It's not the same thing. You're asking like it's black and white, but relationships aren't that simple. People make mistakes." "This isn't about a mistake," I interrupted, my tone still even but firmer now. "It's about intent, about starting something with a lie so big it becomes the foundation of your life. Tell me, Melissa, would you forgive that?" Her jaw tightened. She stared at the carpet for a long beat, then shook her head slowly. "Number, I don't think I could." The silence that followed was heavy, and I let it sit there. Outside, the wind pressed against the window panes, rattling them gently, as though reminding us the world was still moving, no matter what was unraveling inside this house. She finally looked up at me, her eyes glassy, but her expression harder now. "Are you saying that's what Tyler did? That everything between us was just—" She trailed off, as if the last word was too bitter to say aloud. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I slid the box a few inches toward her. "You've read the records. You've seen the dates, the withdrawals, the patterns. You know your own answer better than I ever could." Her gaze dropped to the box again. She didn't reach for it, but she didn't push it away either. "I hate that you might be right," she said finally, almost in a whisper. "That's why I asked you the question," I replied. "Not to hurt you, but because sometimes we can't see our own truth until we hear ourselves say it out loud." Melissa closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with a kind of resignation. "You know, people are going to have opinions about this. If I walk away from him, there will be talk." "There's always talk," I said, "but there's a difference between gossip and living with a lie." For a moment, she just sat there, the ticking of the clock filling the space between us. And I knew, whether she admitted it tonight or not, that the question would keep echoing in her mind long after she left. The next morning, I pulled the worn leather address book from the drawer beside my bed. The edges were frayed, The ink on some pages faded, but one name stood out as clearly as the day I'd written it down. Daniel Prescott, the attorney my late husband had trusted for nearly 3 decades. I hadn't spoken to him since Bill's funeral, but I knew Daniel wasn't the kind of man to ignore a call from me. When he answered, his voice was a warm mix of surprise and concern. "Margaret? It's been far too long. What's going on?" I didn't waste time on small talk. "Daniel, I need your help, and I need it to stay quiet." By noon, I was in his office, sitting across from the same mahogany desk where Bill had once signed our wills. The place hadn't changed, still lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves and the faint scent of old paper and leather. I laid out the documents Tyler hadn't yet seen, the ones I hadn't put in Melissa's gift box. Financial statements, wire transfers, screenshots of property records. "This," I said, tapping a particular sheet, "is a bank account he never told Melissa about. And these," I pointed to 2 printouts, "are withdrawals from an account linked to one of Bill's old partners. An account flagged years ago for irregular activity. Money that went missing before Bill even passed." Daniel adjusted his glasses, leaning in. "And you're certain Tyler's the one making these transfers?" Every date matches up with his trips, his so-called business expenses. I've checked, twice. He sat back, exhaling, slowly. "Margaret, this isn't just a family matter. This is criminal. If this trail holds, he's laundering stolen funds." I met his eyes. "That's why I came to you. I want to do this the right way. No shouting matches, no empty threats. I want the law to knock on his door." Daniel nodded, already flipping open a legal pad. "We'll need to get the right people involved. Financial Crimes Division, maybe even the feds if the amounts are high enough. But first, we build an airtight chain of evidence. If we move too soon, he could bury the trail." The plan took shape over the next hour. Daniel would reach out to a contact in the state's investigative bureau, someone who owed him a favor. I would provide every scrap of documentation I had: paper copies, digital backups, even the handwritten notes I'd made in the margins of old statements. "And Margaret," Daniel added, his pen pausing over the page, "we'll need a trigger event, something to make him move money, something traceable, so the investigators can catch him in real time." I thought for a moment, then remembered Melissa's request for the beach house keys. What if I let him think there's a cash windfall coming his way? Something tied to property or an inheritance. If he believes he has to move funds quickly to secure it, he might use that same hidden account. Daniel's eyes narrowed in thought. Then he smiled faintly. "That could work, but you'd need to dangle it just right. Enough to tempt him, not enough to spook him." We agreed on the next steps. I'd draft a letter, supposedly from an old estate executor, hinting at a payout requiring temporary liquidity. Daniel's contact would set up monitoring on the suspicious account. The moment Tyler initiated a transfer, the system would flag it. Walking out of Daniel's office, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't in months: control. Not just over my own life, but over the outcome of this mess. Back home, I made myself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward like a slow exhale. On the kitchen table, I spread out my files again, this time in neat stacks labeled assets, transfers, statements, personal notes. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure Tyler's kind of manipulation didn't find another target. Melissa could decide for herself whether to stay or go, but she'd be deciding with the truth laid bare. not a fairy tale Tyler had sold her. That night, I typed the letter Daniel and I had discussed, printing it on thick cream paper that looked appropriately official. The words were vague enough to pass casual scrutiny, but to someone like Tyler, hungry for quick access to wealth, they would read like a green light. I sealed it in an envelope, pressing the flap shut with a steady hand. As I did, I realized something. I wasn't nervous. For the first time in a long while, my heartbeat was calm, my breathing even. Tyler thought he had built a house of cards on solid ground. By the time this was over, the law would be pulling out the bottom card themselves, and I wouldn't have to lift a finger, just watch it fall. 3 days after the letter was mailed, Melissa texted me from her car in the grocery store parking lot. "He bought it. I'll send the message you suggested tonight." We had agreed the bait would come from her, not me. Tyler still believed she was swaying between loyalty to him and a cautious trust in me, and that illusion was our strongest weapon. At 7:13 p.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, a screenshot of her text to him. "Hey, Mom's been talking about helping us with that house upgrade. She hinted she could free up some of her late husband's investments. Said she'd talk more if you came by in person." It was casual enough to feel unplanned, but every word had been crafted to press Tyler's buttons. Money, opportunity, and the idea that it was already in motion. He was back in town less than 24 hours later. Melissa told me she'd keep him occupied for a while. Then, remember, to invite me over for coffee so we could all talk. It was, of course, a setup. Though he didn't know the third guest at the table would be a silent one, the recording device in my cardigan pocket. When I opened the door, Tyler wore his best imitation of sincerity. His hair was neatly combed, his shirt collar pressed just a touch too sharp, as if he'd dressed for a job interview. His smile was warm, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Margaret," he began, his tone low and contrite. "I owe you an apology." I motioned him toward the kitchen table, noting how he scanned the room like a man checking for traps. "Do you now?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Melissa slid into the seat beside him, placing a mug of coffee in front of each of us. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes stayed steady. She knew her role. "I've been under a lot of pressure," Tyler continued. "Work, family. I let it get to me. I said things I didn't mean, and I didn't treat you the way Melissa's mother should be treated." A microspike landed here. His phrasing was too polished, as if rehearsed. Real remorse usually stumbles over its own words. I sipped my coffee, giving him room to keep talking. And I think we can put the past behind us. Start fresh." He reached for Melissa's hand, giving it a squeeze. "Especially with this house upgrade. We can all be on the same page now." Melissa nodded faintly, but I caught the flicker in her gaze. She'd noticed it, too. He was sliding money talk into the forgiveness speech. I let a beat of silence hang, then asked, "So what exactly would you need to start fresh, Tyler?" He leaned back, feigning casualness. "Just liquidity, you know? Moving things around so we can get a better mortgage rate. I can handle all the paperwork if you'd like, make it easy for you." There it was, the second spike. His earlier apology had been about mending fences. Now it was a logistics meeting about accessing funds. Melissa shifted in her chair, her jaw tightening. "We haven't even talked about what kind of place we'd want," she said lightly, testing him. "Oh, we don't have to overcomplicate it," he replied, waving a dismissive hand. "Once the funds are ready, I'll sort the rest. You'll both thank me later." I glanced down at my cup, swirling the last of the coffee. "Funny," I murmured. "Bill always said the best investments were the ones you could explain in a single sentence. If it takes more words, you probably shouldn't touch it." Tyler laughed, too quickly, too loud, and countered, "Well, times change. You have to be more creative these days." Another spike. Creative. In Tyler's mouth, it meant bending rules until they snapped. We spent another 20 minutes circling the subject. Every so often, he'd drop a contradictory detail, claiming first that his job was solid, then admitting he was between contracts, insisting he'd never touch family money, then proposing temporary transfers to cover expenses. Melissa kept her composure, but I could feel the tension in her stillness. She was connecting the dots in real time, hearing the gaps in his story the way I had months earlier. Finally, Tyler stood, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve. "I'll draw up a few ideas. Send them your way. No rush, of course." I smiled faintly, the kind that offered nothing. Of course. No rush. As the door shut behind him, Melissa exhaled hard, like she'd been holding her breath since he arrived. "Mom," she said quietly, "he's lying." About everything. I reached across the table, taking her hand, not as bait this time, but as an anchor. "Then it's time," I said, my voice steady, "to let the truth do the talking." In my pocket, the recorder's tiny red light winked once before turning off. Every spike, every slip, every contradiction was now preserved, not just in my mind, but in a file that would be hard to argue with when the right people pressed play. It happened faster than even I'd imagined. 2 days after our coffee chat, Melissa sent Tyler a casual text about dropping by to finalize their house upgrade plans. She copied me on the time, 3 p.m., and left the rest to the people who'd been quietly circling him for weeks. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to take part in the conversation, but to be present. I carried a thermos of Earl Grey, poured into my favorite china cup, and settled at the corner of Melissa's dining table. To anyone looking in, I was simply an aging mother enjoying her tea while her daughter and son-in-law talked about real estate. Tyler breezed in at exactly 3 o'clock, wearing the same polished air as before, but with a twitch of excitement he couldn't hide. He barely greeted me before diving into the pitch. How quickly we could reallocate funds, how seamlessly he could handle the transactions without troubling me with paperwork. Melissa nodded and asked the leading questions we'd rehearsed. What if Mom doesn't want to mix her money into this? What would you do then? He laughed, leaning back like the question was ridiculous. Of course she will. That's why I married you. He paused, smirking as if it were a private joke. Not just for the love, you know? We're building a future here, and her resources, they make that possible. The words were barely out of his mouth when the front door swung open. Federal agents! The air changed in an instant. 2 men in jackets with bold yellow FBI lettering moved in, followed by a woman holding a folder thick with papers. Tyler froze, his smirk curdling into something slack and colorless. "Tyler Grant?" one of them said sharply. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud." The cuffs clicked around his wrists with a metallic certainty, the sound punctuating the moment like a gavel strike. Melissa sat back, wide-eyed but steady. She glanced at me, not for guidance, but to confirm what she already knew. This was the end of his little empire. Tyler turned toward me then, his face twisted in disbelief. You set me up? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Instead, I placed my teacup gently onto its saucer. The china gave a soft, decisive clink. In that small sound was everything. The months of quiet watching, the slow collecting of threads, the patience to let them knot themselves around him. The lead agent read Tyler his rights while another began listing the evidence. Bank transfers tied to shell accounts, offshore holdings linked to a dissolved partnership from my late husband's firm, records of communications where Tyler outlined his strategy to marry into financial security. He sputtered, trying to deny it, but each protest was swallowed by another fact, another document, another timestamp. The case against him was no longer a web. It was a wall, solid and unmovable. Melissa's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her shoulders tense but her chin high. She didn't look at Tyler again after the agents started guiding him toward the door. When they stepped outside, I caught a glimpse of the neighborhood kids paused mid-game on the sidewalk, their basketball resting against the curb. Tyler's eyes darted around, as if looking for a corner to disappear into, but there was nowhere to go. The last thing I saw before the door shut was the gleam of the handcuffs in the afternoon light, a reversal so complete it almost felt unreal. Inside, the silence was thick. Melissa's first breath came out shaky. I don't know if I should thank you or hate you for not telling me sooner. I met her gaze, my own, steady. I didn't want you to hear it from me. I wanted you to hear it from him. She looked down, the fight draining out of her. Well, I heard it. I stood, gathering my cup and saucer. The tea was lukewarm now, but I took one last sip before heading to the kitchen. Outside, the sound of car doors and distant engine noise faded. For the first time in months, the house felt still. Not empty, just still. The kind of stillness that follows after something false has been cleared away. I rinsed the cup, dried it carefully, and placed it back in its spot in the cabinet. Sometimes, you don't need to shout for justice to arrive. Sometimes, all it takes is patience and knowing when to put the cup down. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnished wood and paper, an odd mix of permanence and fragility. I sat in the second row, hands folded neatly in my lap, while the murmur of voices filled the room like the low hum of an approaching storm. Melissa was already at the front, standing beside the prosecutor. She looked smaller than usual under the weight of the setting, but there was a steadiness in her posture that hadn't been there months ago. Today, she wasn't Tyler's wife. She was a witness. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge entered, a tall man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Tyler was led in, flanked by two deputies. He wore a plain gray suit instead of his tailored blazers, but the arrogance clung to him like a second skin. He glanced at me once, smirk curling, as if to say this was all a misunderstanding he'd talk his way out of. He didn't notice Janice, 3 seats to my left. She sat straight-backed, her hands resting lightly on her purse, her eyes fixed on the front. When she caught my gaze, she gave the smallest of nods, silent acknowledgement that we'd both arrived at the same conclusion about him, just by different roads. The prosecutor began with Melissa. Mrs. Grant, can you describe when you first became aware of financial irregularities involving your husband? Melissa's voice was calm, deliberate. She recounted the little things, cash withdrawals with vague explanations, documents she wasn't allowed to see, sudden trips for business. Then she spoke of the box I'd given her, the files inside, The night she sat at my kitchen table tracing every line of numbers. Tyler's attorney tried to rattle her, throwing out words like family disputes and emotional bias. But Melissa didn't flinch. "This isn't about bias," she said, her voice carrying through the quiet. "It's about truth. And I have no interest in protecting a lie." Then came the other witnesses. Two women I'd never met until that morning. One had been engaged to Tyler 5 years ago. The other had worked alongside him at a small investment firm before my husband's death. Their stories were uncomfortably familiar. The charm, the whirlwind romance or friendship, the sudden entanglement in joint opportunities, and the inevitable vanishing act when questions arose. Both women had lost not just money, but trust in people, in their own judgment. Listening to them was like hearing echoes of the same song, sung in different keys. It struck me then that my role hadn't been unique, just the latest verse in a pattern that might have gone on indefinitely if someone hadn't cut the music. During a recess, I stepped into the hallway for air. The light from the tall windows fell across the marble floor, pooling in soft gold. Janice came to stand beside me. "You know," she said quietly, "the first time I saw him with Melissa, I thought, he's playing her. I just didn't have the proof." "You gave me the thread," I replied. "I just pulled it." She gave a short laugh, not unkind. "Well, you pulled it all right." Then, more softly, "She's lucky you're her mother." When we returned to the courtroom, it was time for the defense to present their case. Tyler took the stand. He tried the old performance, humble tones, regretful expressions, but it rang hollow. Every carefully chosen word fell against the solid wall of evidence the prosecutor had built. Each denial was met with a date, a signature, a bank transfer that told a different story. I watched him search the room, perhaps hoping to find even one sympathetic face. But Melissa stared straight ahead. The other women's gazes were cool, and Janice's eyes were steady on him like a pin holding an insect in place. By the time the judge called for closing statements, the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer about whether he was guilty. It was about how long it would take for the gavel to confirm it. The prosecutor ended simply, "Your Honor, this is not just a case of financial crime. It is a case of deliberate exploitation, of trust, of love, and of the belief that people will look the other way when betrayal wears a charming face." When court adjourned for the day, we filed out slowly. In the corridor, Melissa came to stand beside me. She didn't speak at first, just let out a long breath. "You were right," she finally said. "Some truths you have to see for yourself." I touched her hand lightly, "And now you have." As we walked toward the exit, I caught Janice's eye one last time. She gave me that same small nod, and I returned it. No words needed. The work was done. The sentencing hearing was quieter than the trial had been. No media crew, no rows of strangers, just the people who had been there from the start, carrying the weight of the last few months. Tyler stood at the defendant's table, wrists unshackled for the formality of the proceeding. But the deputies at his side made the limits clear. He looked smaller somehow, as if the endless months of legal battles had eroded the sharp edges of his self-assurance. Still, his eyes darted around the room, searching for something. Pity, perhaps. He didn't find it. The judge read the charges and the verdict. For the crimes of wire fraud, misappropriation of funds, and willful deception for personal gain, the court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison. A pause, Then the secondary ruling: restitution in the amount of $640,000, payable to the victims named. There was no dramatic gasp, no collapse into sobs. Tyler's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the bench. The gavel strike was sharp and final, echoing against the paneled walls like the closing of a door that would not open again. Melissa sat in the row ahead of me, her back straight, her chin lifted. She didn't turn to look at Tyler, not once. Janice was beside her, hands folded, her expression unreadable. I thought of the strange symmetry of it, how two women who had once been strangers, linked only by suspicion, were now bound by the shared knowledge of who he truly was. As the courtroom emptied, Melissa lingered in her seat. I waited, giving her space. Eventually, she rose and walked toward me. There was no trace of the tearful, frantic voice I had heard on the phone months ago. Instead, her tone was calm, almost reflective. "You remember that night?" she said. "When you made tea and I sat at your table with all those papers spread out?" I nodded. "You told me," she continued. "Some traditions keep you warm. At the time, I thought you meant family." She gave a small, bittersweet smile. "Now I think I understand. Some traditions do keep you warm, and some you have to rebuild yourself." The words settled in the space between us, not as a wound, but as a quiet truth. Outside, the air was crisp, the winter light pale but steady. We walked together down the courthouse steps, the sound of our heels on stone, rhythmic and grounding. Janice joined us at the base of the stairs. "He won't have the chance to do this again," she said simply. "No," I replied, "but more than that, Melissa won't give him the chance." Melissa glanced at me, and for a moment I saw not the hurt or the betrayal, but the beginnings of something stronger. It wasn't defiance, exactly. It was a kind of self-possession, an understanding that her life, from here on, was hers to shape. We parted ways at the curb. Janice and I exchanged one last look, the unspoken acknowledgement that the circle had closed. She had been the spark, I had been the hand that pulled the thread, and Melissa had walked herself through the open door. When I returned home, I put the kettle on, the same teapot, the same chipped mug I'd used that night. Steam rose in lazy spirals, and I thought about traditions, how some are inherited, some are salvaged, and some are entirely new. Melissa's voice replayed in my mind. And some you rebuild yourself. It struck me that maybe that was the real inheritance we give one another, not objects, not money, but the permission to take what is good, leave what is harmful, and start again without apology. I carried my tea to the window and watched the pale sun dip lower, turning the edges of the clouds to gold. The house was quiet, but not empty. Not anymore. The beach house breathed differently in late autumn. The sharp tang of salt was gentler, the waves rolling in with a slower rhythm, as if even the ocean had decided to rest after the long summer. The porch boards creaked under the weight of two chairs, side by side, facing the horizon. Melissa and I sat there, each cradling a porcelain cup of tea. The air was cool enough to make the steam curl thick and visible, twisting upward before disappearing into the fading light. The set was the same one I had used for years, white with a delicate blue vine circling the rim, except for the cup in Melissa's hands. That one was new. She'd found it at a little shop in town and said it looked like it belonged. It did. She rested the cup on her knee for a moment, tracing the handle with her thumb. "I wanted you to have one that was yours," she said quietly. Not because you needed another cup, but because, well, some things deserve a new start. I smiled, letting the warmth of the tea seep into my hands. The wind played with a strand of her hair, and for the first time in months, I saw a softness in her face, not the brittleness of someone holding themselves together, but the steadiness of someone who has begun to trust the ground beneath her feet again. We didn't speak much after that. The silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. The kind of quiet that feels earned, like a shared blanket on a cold day. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a wash of gold and rose across the water. A few gulls drifted lazily overhead, their calls distant, unhurried. Melissa took a sip and leaned back in her chair. "It's strange," she said finally. "I thought this place would always remind me of him, of the lies." She glanced around. The weathered railings, the potted rosemary still clinging to green despite the season. But it doesn't, not anymore. I understood. The house hadn't changed. We had. From the kitchen, the faint clink of the kettle settling on the stove reached us, carried through the open door. I thought about all the afternoons I had sat here alone, cup in hand, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. And now, here we were, two women who had survived the same storm, sitting in the calm that followed. Melissa's eyes followed a fishing boat heading back toward the harbor. "I keep thinking about traditions," she said. "Not the ones you're handed, but the ones you make yourself." She looked at me, her expression open, almost shy. "Do you think we could start some? Just ours?" I let the question settle between us, tasting the weight of it. Then I nodded. "Yes," I said simply. "We can." A lone shell clattered against the porch as the tide shifted below, and the smell of the sea deepened, mixing with the faint scent of tea leaves. The light was falling faster now, deepening into that in-between shade where the world feels briefly suspended. Melissa lifted her cup in a quiet toast. I did the same, and for a moment we held each other's gaze before drinking. No words, no promises, just the shared understanding that the worst was behind us, and the rest was ours to build. A small smile tugged at her lips as she set her cup down. "Next summer," she began, her eyes scanning the porch rafters, "maybe we'll string the lights again." I looked up at the empty hooks where they used to hang, remembering the soft glow they cast on warm evenings, the way they made the air hum with something unnameable. And I thought, yes, next summer, maybe we will.